Hi and welcome to this Elizabeth I GCSE lesson number 1. You are going to need a lesson notes pack, which you should find in class charts or you find it on Pod, and there's also a link to it in the description of this video. It should look something like this. You'll need this pack to make your notes in. It has the links in it to the other video clips that we will use in the different lessons. You could either print it out and you could write on it, or you can just type in it as you go, and then you'll have it all in one place and you can print it out at a later date. Now, the main purpose of this pack and these lessons is to ensure that we cover the first part of the Elizabeth module, so that when we come back to school we have made some decent progress on that module. You can see that the main part that we will focus on in the first of these lessons is the blue section of this overview, where we're going to have a look at Elizabeth herself and her government and religion in Elizabethan society. Okay, so we come to our first task, which is an inference task. You've got this image and you've got this question in the first page of your lesson pack. Remember, when we are inferring, we are trying to say what the source suggests about the particular focus of the question. So what does this source suggest about the nature of Elizabethan society? You need to make two inferences, and you need to be able to support those inferences based on something that you can see in the particular image. So what I want you to do is to pause now and then have a go at it yourself. Okay, welcome back. Let's think about some of the things that you may have inferred from this source. Well, we could certainly infer that the Queen is incredibly important. Look where she is in the center of the image. Look at the way she's been painted. Look at the way the light shines on her. We could also infer that wealth and power are incredibly important in Elizabethan society. Look at the way the people around her are dressed. Look at the way she herself is dressed. We could infer how important the Queen is from the protection that she is obviously enjoying in this particular image. Look at the way in which the men who are carrying her have their hands on their sword. They are there to protect her. We could infer how adored she is, and certainly that's the way that the person who painted the image wants us to think. Look at the way people are gazing upon her in awe. Okay, so if you got some of those and you've written them down, brilliant, well done. If there's some of them that you didn't quite get, then add them on to maybe the notes that you made. And if you got some different ones, brilliant. As long as you supported your inference with something in the source, then that's absolutely fine. What we're now going to do is move on to have a look at the first video clip. So you'll need to use your pack. You need to go into your pack, find the link, and you're going to watch this video clip. When you're watching it, I want you to think about the two sources that the historian looks at and what they tell us about Elizabeth and the society that she lived in. So you're going to need to pause me again, open up the video in the other link and watch it. Okay, welcome back. So what that clip tells us is a lot about the society in which Elizabeth became queen in. It tells us a lot about her as a person, some of the problems that she faced. You know, at a very young age, being that close to possibly dying at the hands of her sister because she was accused of being involved in this plot. It helps us to understand how fragile her position as queen was, and it helps us to understand how much she needed people in Elizabethan society to see her as a very powerful ruler, so that they didn't threaten her. And one of the things that we'll return to later in this module is how she was threatened and the problems that she faced. So really what those sources tell us is that Elizabeth's time as queen was quite fragile at times, and they also tell us that society in Elizabethan times was all about power, and you had to prove that you had the power to rule over the people, and if you showed a weakness, then you might lose that power. Okay, so we've looked at Elizabeth herself, and we've kind of inferred from a source and looked at some sources in terms of what society was like. We're now going to look at what society was like in a bit more detail. So you're going to use this first excerpt from the textbook, which is in your lesson notes pack, and I want you to read it, and I want you to think about what it tells us specifically about the nature of Elizabethan society. So you need to pause me again, read the information, make some notes underneath, and then we'll come back and see what you got. Okay, so what we should have learnt from reading that, and what we should have noted down, is how hierarchical Elizabethan society was, how stratified it was. If you look at the pyramids that show you how society was broken down both in the rural areas and in towns and cities, you can see that there's a very small number of people at the top of society who hold the most power, and the vast majority of people at the bottom of society hold very little power at all. So the nobility, the people at court who had Elizabeth's ear, the people who could influence her, these powerful people at the top of society had all of the influence, and people at the bottom of society had very little influence and very little power at all. So we see how really structured in a hierarchical way Elizabethan society was, and that's really important as we go through this course to understand why some people had very little power at all, some people had very little influence over what was going on in the country, whereas gentry and nobility, people at the top and people around the Queen, had lots and lots of power. So now we turn to the power that Elizabeth herself had and how she operated as the monarch, as the leader of the country. So again, you're going to need to read a little excerpt from the textbook, which you find in your lesson notes pack. You need to pause this, read it, think about how much power Elizabeth had and how she used that power. Okay, welcome back. So the really important thing here to stress is how much power Queen Elizabeth had, how much power the monarch had. If you look in the little key terms box, the divine right is really, really important. Monarchs at this time believed in the divine right, the idea that in actual fact their right to govern, their right to be in charge was given by God. And this will become really important later on in Elizabeth's relationship with Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots was a problem for Elizabeth, but she believed that Mary, Queen of Scots was a divine ruler, just like she was a divine ruler. She'd been given her throne by God, and so who was Elizabeth to take that throne away from her by executing her to remove the threat that she posed? Another important thing to note is patronage. Elizabeth would give lands, give titles, give money and riches to people in return for their loyalty, in return for their service. And note the importance or lack thereof of Parliament. Parliament is there as something, a body that can advise and can come up with some laws, but really Elizabeth doesn't have to pay that much attention to Parliament. She can close Parliament down, she can use the royal prerogative. If Parliament's talking about something that she doesn't want them to talk about, then she can just close them down and she can not bother listening to what their advice or what their ideas are. So really what we see here is how very, very important the monarch was, how much power Elizabeth had, which gave her the opportunity to run the country in a way that she could be quite stubborn and she could decide policy based on what her opinion was. She didn't necessarily have to do what a parliament told her. She took the advice of her Secretary of State and other Privy Councillors, but once they'd given her advice, she could still do what she wanted. There was nothing constitutionally to stop her from doing the things that she wanted to do, and there was very little power that Parliament had compared to the power that the monarch had. Okay, so we've just about come to the end of this first lesson on Elizabeth I. And we want to think about what the key features of Elizabethan society were, based on how it was governed and based on the role of the monarch. This idea of describing key features or identifying key features is something that will come up in later lessons. There is a 4-mark question on the Elizabeth I section of the exam paper which asks us to describe 2 features, where we're essentially identifying something and then explaining it. So if we are identifying and explaining some key features of Elizabethan government and society, there are several things that we could probably identify, and you could write these down next to the or underneath the question, the last question in your lesson notes pack for this lesson. So, for example, we could say that one feature of Elizabethan society was that it's extremely hierarchical and stratified. So society had a very small number of rich people at the top and a very large number of not so rich people at the bottom. We could say that one feature of Elizabethan society and government was the power of the monarch and the way in which the monarch was able to use patronage and the way in which he believed in the divine right to rule and govern the country. We could say another feature of Elizabethan society and government in particular was the way in which the Parliament operated to give advice to the Queen, to suggest policy, but that in fact the Queen could overrule. We could say that another feature of Elizabethan society, and thinking about Elizabeth herself, and we'll come on to this again in a later lesson, was how much power was concentrated in the monarch, but also in the case of Elizabeth, how fragile sometimes that power was and how vulnerable she was as a queen, and somebody who faced quite a lot of threats to her power, who could have lost that power at any time. Okay, so what's important is that you get this sense of how power is concentrated at the top of Elizabethan society, that government operates in a way in which everybody in around the monarch essentially works towards pleasing her or carrying out her policies, but that because so much power is concentrated in one person, that means there's the potential for people who disagree with that person, the potential for people who don't want that person to be monarch. There's a potential for that person to be removed in order to be replaced with somebody else because so much power is invested and concentrated in that one person. And that is really the important point about Elizabethan government and society that you should have got from this lesson. The power of the monarch, the importance of that one figurehead at the top of society, but also how Elizabeth her power was actually quite fragile because such was the concentration of power. At any point, if somebody overthrows her or takes that power away, then she would have lost her crown and lost her influence entirely. Right, well, I hope that's been helpful, and I look forward to lesson 2. Thanks very much. Take care, bye-bye.